So I wanted to start, I'm going to try and keep track of time. I'll be doing sort of 20 minutes on adaptive interventions and then jumping over to SMART trials. So first, I want to define an adaptive intervention, talk about what the key components are. Then I'll give you an example, and then I'll just have I have a few questions that I commonly get asked, and I just wanted to go over those at least to sort of facilitate some Q&A. So what is an adaptive intervention? And I think the most common, or the thing I see the most happen the most often when people are getting introduced to these topics is they conflate the intervention design and the experimental design. So an adaptive intervention is an intervention design. It's not an experimental design. The idea behind it is you're going to use ongoing information about the participant to modify type, intensity, or modality of the intervention. So you can think of it as the difference between, let me move everyone's faces. Sorry, I have to move your little faces away from my slides. So I'm going to move you over here. So if you see me looking this way, it's to look at all of you. And this is where my slides are, just so you don't get confused. So it often sounds like when you're building these types of adaptive interventions, they're like other types of educational, clinical policy, or public health practice. The difference, I think, for many situations is that adaptive interventions are protocolized. So we'll talk about what that protocol looks like. And they're often evidence-based, so that you're trying to use data you've collected to build an adaptive intervention. So here's an example I want to walk you through to just sort of talk about the key elements. And this is in the context of childhood ADHD treatment. And the study here was sort of built from a study run by Bill Pelham at Florida International University. You have individuals who have ADHD. You have a study in which at the beginning of the school year, those individuals will be assigned to low-dose medication. And then monthly, starting at 8 weeks, you're going to assess if the child responds. And we can talk about what we mean by respond. But for now, I'm just going to sort of categorize it as yes, no, meaning it's a binary indicator of whether or not we say that the individual has responded. What you're going to do if they say yes is you're just going to continue with the low dose medication. If you say no, we're going to augment with a behavioral intervention. So I want to point out multiple components of what's going on in this adaptive intervention. The first is that we're going to be monitoring this individual monthly. And so this is what we talk about decision points. Decision points are the moments at which we're going to decide what to do or how to change treatment. So in this particular case, decisions are made monthly, starting at 8 weeks. The next thing we're going to do is decide at those monthly moments, what are we going to do and what variables are we going to use to decide the types of interventions we consider. And these are called tailoring variables. So in this particular case, child response status was based on a few different measurements. So it was based on sort of a list of target behaviors that these individuals should have, as well as a rating scale that was built in 2006. And so there was a rule built by the study team, built by Bill Pelham, to combine these different measures to decide if the individual responded or didn't respond. So in this particular case, the tailoring variable is a binary indicator. You also have thresholds or levels. So again, the tailoring variables here are these measurements. The thresholds are those thresholds to convert it to the binary indicator of yes, no. And then we have our intervention options. So given the tailoring variables and our thresholds, we have yes, no, and then we have to decide what we're going to do based on those different values. So in this particular case, you have to decide what intervention options are feasible to give if the individual responds versus if the individual does not respond. So in this particular case, if an individual responded, meaning they said yes, it was decided that the only intervention option that should be provided is to continue with their low-dose medication. If the individual does not respond, then we're going to augment with a behavioral intervention. I should point out here that this list, and it's one of my Q&As later down the line, this does not have to be a single variable, meaning the intervention options can be a list of alternatives you might consider. So it can be a behavioral intervention A as well as a behavioral intervention B, and you might have some decisions you make about which one is more appropriate in a given context. And so this sequence here that we just talked about, we think about as an adaptation. It's using the ongoing or dynamic information about the individual to decide whether and how to intervene on the person. It combines the tailoring variable, the thresholds and levels, and the intervention options to decide what to do. And it's guided by the outcomes of interest. So in this particular case, there's two types of outcomes we think about in the context of adaptive interventions: proximal and distal outcomes. So distal outcomes are the ultimate goal of the intervention, the goal that you're trying to achieve. In this example here, the ultimate goal is to reduce classroom rule violations by the end of the school year. So you should think of it as sort of, I'm building an adaptive intervention. What is my distal goal? It is going to guide you through the design of this AI. The proximal outcomes are the things that the adaptive intervention is targeting directly. So in this particular case, the proximal outcomes are to reduce behavioral difficulties and impairment in the course of the school year. So you're monitoring monthly and you're trying to achieve these proximal outcomes. And by achieving those proximal outcomes, your goal is to achieve the distal outcome. Okay, so it's sort of a, if you think sort of in a mediational way, these are proximal outcomes are mediators on some pathway to achieve a distal outcome. And so your AI you're building is really trying to improve those mediators and thus improve the distal outcome. So these are your main components of an AI. And when I talk about AIs, I try and talk about these 5 components. You have decision points, tailoring variables, thresholds, intervention options, and the outcomes. And you're trying to combine these to make an adaptive rule, which is depends on this ongoing information. The 2 things I wanted to mention, again, I already mentioned one of them, was this is a particular example of an AI. There are other things you can do in building an AI. So one question I often get asked is, must an adaptive intervention recommend a single intervention component at each decision point? The answer is no. So an example here would you may augment with behavioral intervention or consider increasing medication dose. And so in this particular case, you'd have 2 different options available in the adaptive intervention. And the other thing I like to mention is, can the tailoring variables differ based on previous interventions? And of course they can. So in this particular case here, you're going to depend on, is there symptom reduction versus one could depend on, do you improve the target behaviors? So this is changing what we mean by response when we're talking about the AI. So the tailoring variables are changing, and you can have the tailoring variables be previous intervention results. The other question that I often get asked is it the case that adaptive interventions are non-standard because they involve randomization? And I think what this question often revolves around is, and this is what we're going to talk about next, so I want to mention it, is we're going to talk about SMART trials, which involve sequentially randomizing individuals to treatment. In the case of building an AI or thinking of an AI, in most clinical settings, you're not going to randomize as part of the intervention. So when we're thinking about an optimized adaptive intervention, it's going to be a deterministic rule typically that's built. And the reason being, in most clinical settings, we're not going to think it feasible to build in the randomization that we might have in the SMART trial. So we'll talk about that down the line. But I just want to point out that in no part of the AI we just talked about is there a randomized component going on. And then the last question, and it's something that I talked about last year, I believe, when I talked about missing data, is how do I address missing data in an adaptive intervention? And I just want to point out here that in the context of AIs, we're not talking about statistical analysis of an experiment. We're talking about how to build a treatment in the absence of a tailoring variable, potentially. So a missing data problem might be that we just don't have the rating scale, for example. The individual just didn't fill out the rating scale at those monthly visits. And so the question is less, how do we analyze data coming from a trial with missing data, but more, how do we build an intervention, an adaptive intervention that handles the missing data as part of it? And so in this particular example, we can see that if we measure the symptoms, then we can do the same rule we talked about before, yes, no. If we don't measure the symptoms, we will treat it in this particular AI as the same as if we had not seen a reduction in symptoms, and so they get augmented with a behavioral intervention. And so I just want to point out that the missing data in the context of AIs is more about intervention design. And I'll talk about missing data in the context of smarts after this, which will be how do we analyze data when we have how do we analyze smart data when we have missingness? And with this, I just want to open it up to everybody and just make sure we're all on the same page about what an AI is, the 5 key components. And in particular, what I want you to get away from this slide is that it's really just all about using this ongoing information. What I want you to get out is the sort of 5 key components and how they interact to do this adaptation process. So are there any questions so far? I just want to pause and open it up.
Yes, this is CJ. I have a question about choosing the tailoring variables. It sounds like it's very important because it's in clinical practice is a decision, right? You need to do additional things or you need to scale up or scale down. So do you think is, I don't know a lot in this AI research. Do people usually use more like a reliable already published, or they develop their own, could be a good few questionnaires or questions to asking the participants?
That's a great question. So let me go back just to this example here. So in this particular case, these were different measures that, based on the literature, the team thought were indicative of a child responding to treatment. And so it was a combination of, it was the scientific team's decision to sort of incorporate both the target behaviors and this impairment rating scale. And so when you're building an AI, the typical way people think about it is response and non-response is going to be a potentially complex function of a few different measurements you might have on that individual. So, so just as another example, right, the key question would be, a priori, you might not know how to tailor. And so so we're going to talk about smarts in a second. So a question as part of the smart might be, how do I define non-response or response to build my adaptive intervention? Now, typically what people will do is they'll use historical data and use the literature to guide their initial definition of response, non-response. And I think that's the typical way to do it. But we're trying to be, I think, moving forward, and I know Danny's done a lot of work to Daniel Almiral, who I don't know if you've talked to, but he's done a lot of work in the smart area to kind of move away from a fixed definition that you can't learn on to be a little bit more flexible and redefining non-response using a data. But the typical one would be you as a scientific team sit down and say, based on the literature, how should we define non-response? And using that definition of non-response, we're going to move ahead with these different intervention options. One more thing I just want to say, CJ, non-response can be 2 different things. So for example, in a drug trial program, I also use it as an example in others, not these slides, but in other slides, you could have non-response due to non-compliance. So someone's just not complying with the protocol. And you could have non-response because they're complying with the protocol, but the treatment is just not working for them. And in those cases, you'd have 2 different pathways forward. So for non-compliers, you might try different types of treatments, sort of enforcing a stronger schedule for that person to comply with. While for a non-responder due to sort of the treatment not working, you might do something different. And so often for more complicated AIs, it won't just be a yes, no binary, but it'll be different thresholds based on different tailoring variables will trigger different intervention options.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Other questions?
Hi, Walter. This is Erica.
Hi, Erica.
Hi. So I have another question related to the tailoring variables. Could you talk a little bit about the challenge of the timing to ask the questions? I don't know if you're going to talk about this later when you talk about the adaptive trials, or if you could address this right now.
So let me just rephrase your question to make sure I understand. When you're talking about the timing, you're talking about, and let me go back, this sort of decision point timing around when to do and when to monitor.
Yes, if I ask too early or if I ask too late, yeah.
So the guiding principle behind decision points, and this will, I'm going to reiterate this when we move to JEDIs, is at what time scale do you expect meaningful changes in the tailoring variables to take place? So in the context of most adaptive interventions, you're thinking that, and I say most, I don't want to be too specific because it will vary, but you're thinking that you're expecting meaningful changes in sort of the response to medication at the monthly scale. So if you monitor it more frequently, you could monitor it more frequently, but you would make decision points monthly because you're expecting response to be sort of changing meaningfully at the month level. When we move to JEDIs, the key conceptual difference for JEDIs is you're expecting meaningful changes over much more frequent time spans. And so in that context, you might have to move to monitoring and decision points at the minute, hour, day level. But in this example and most AI examples, you'll think weekly or maybe monthly.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Other questions? Okay.
I have one question before you go on.
Not a problem.
This is John. It's more, you were hitting on this point earlier, like if you have non-response and you have a behavioral intervention option you go to, and that behavioral intervention can have various levels of intensity as one possible method, depending on the level of non-responsiveness. From there, I don't know if this is more smart stuff or does this continue to be more AI, but can, depending on the level of response, even after that standpoint, can you another level of behavioral intervention again to address that again? But I don't know if that's smart or is this just a continuation of AI?
So I think what you're getting at, and this is something we'll talk about with smarts, is like there'll be questions when you're designing your AI and building an adaptive intervention. And so that kind of question would have implications about the type of smart trial you would run. But let's just talk about in the context of an AI, which is as an intervention design, there's nothing stopping you from having this plus behavioral intervention be, well, we're going to continue to monitor that individual. And if even after that behavioral intervention, we still see that they're not responding, we can increase even further and include other options like more behavioral intervention or increased dose of the medication. Yeah. There's definitely flexibility within the framework to handle that. I think what we're going to come to when we talk about the SMART trial is these types of questions that will come up. There's often the case of how do we continue to, what do we start with and what do we augment with, and how do we continue to augment? I think that'll be, those types of questions come up a lot when we talk about the SMART trial. But yeah, no, the flexibility inside the adaptive intervention framework is there to incorporate that. And I think just to point it out, this example here, right? You could continue this path where after they don't respond and you've given them behavioral interventions, there's no reason you couldn't then move to, well, we already gave them behavioral intervention. Did we improve their target behavior? Oh no, let's add even more behavioral interventions to that on top of it. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. And I think that's a good segue to, and I apologize, I made a bunch of PowerPoints with different module names to avoid the situation where I had a never-ending PowerPoint. So we're going to be hopping between PowerPoints, but I think what that really brings into light is, and thanks again for the question, John, is what's the difference between an adaptive intervention and a SMART trial, and how do we connect the two? So the kind of question John asked was, well, what about this particular extension of this adaptive intervention I've already built? Can I augment with additional things? And the way the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial works is it's really an experimental design to answer questions you have about adaptive interventions in the course of building what we think of as like an optimized adaptive intervention. So we're going to skip from the example I gave you before to a slightly different example. This is children with autism who are minimally verbal, and this is a particular adaptive intervention you could build in that population, in which you start with discrete trial training, DTT. It's a adult-led, highly structured behavioral teaching approach. So this is one AI. You could start with DTT. For responders, you continue, and for slower responders, you augment with an additional thing called Jasper, which is joint attention, symbolic, play, engagement, and regulation, which is sort of a mechanism for improving development and behavior, using developmental and behavioral principles to improve outcomes for individuals with autism. So this is one AI, to go back to the previous set of slides, you could build. But you have questions, right? The key point here is, when you think of this AI, and I write down this AI, I have questions about its design. So first of all, can we do more to help these children? Well, do some need more? So DTT is quite intensive, but Jasper is a little bit less intensive. So do we always need to start with DTT? Do others require less? So maybe I can get away with starting with Jasper and moving on to DTT as an augmentation strategy. Maybe one of these two strategies is just always better. And so I have lots of questions about these adaptive interventions that I'm building. And so this is just a different AI I could build. I could have just started with Jasper, and for slower responders, augmented with DTT. And another thing I could have done, I could have just done Jasper only for 16 weeks or DT only for 16 weeks. And we're going to pretend we're in a scenario where I just don't know which of these AIs, or even these simpler intervention options, was the better approach. So I have questions I want to answer. And so I want to build an experiment to answer those types of scientific questions. So the questions I mentioned for this particular example, you can write them very generically. And I think I write them this way. So for those of you who move into different areas, you can kind of see the similarity, which is, often you ask, how long should we offer the first treatment option? So that was sort of about the decision points question. What tactics should we use for non-responders? What should we do for responders? How do you re-engage people who are non-adherent? And what is the most effective delivery location for the intervention? So these are types of questions you might have. Other questions you might have: what is the most effective delivery location? What is the most effective delivery mode? What is the best way to define non-response? So these are all questions you can ask. I'm going to focus for the most part on what tactic should I start out with? So what should be my initial treatment strategy? And then what should be my treatment strategy for non-responders? So those are the two questions I'm going to focus on. I just want to point out that there's other questions, other optimization-based questions you can ask in this framework. And so what the SMART does, here it's an experimental design. It's not an intervention design. The SMART is a multi-stage randomized trial. Sequential multiple assignment randomized trial, where at each stage it corresponds to a scientific question or questions you're trying to answer. And a randomization takes place at each decision point to answer that scientific question of interest. So let me go back to my example before. The SMART that I would design to answer the questions about what should be my initial strategy, and then what should I be doing for responders and non-responders, might look like this, which is, at the first stage, I don't know if I should start with DTT or Jasper. And so I actually randomize individuals to start with one of these two strategies. So you can, most SMARTs will look like kind of like a tree structure. So the first part of your tree is just, at baseline, I don't know what to start with, so I'm going to randomize between these two options. And then for responders, I actually have two things that were thought of by the scientific team. This was PI Connie Kasari at UCLA. You can either continue with DTT or continue with the strategy you were using, or improve parent training. So for responders, you don't focus on the kid, you focus on the parent. That was the idea behind including this other option. For non-responders, you have the augmentation strategies we talked about before. So this is a SMART trial. The SMART trial involves two decision points. The first one's at week 0. What should be my initial strategies? And then at week 6, I re-randomize based on response status. And those re-randomizations are either to a parent training for responders or an augmentation strategy for non-responders. And you can see now that there's actually 8 different buckets at the final outcome. So if you look across these pathways, you have A through H that could happen to any given individual, depending on how they were randomized and how they were assessed for response status. Okay. And so now there's different questions we can ask with data from a SMART trial. So smarts allow you to ask the following types of questions. And so I want to point this out because even though we're at a mobile health training institute, we'll talk about how mobile technologies can be used inside of smarts. There are certain types of questions that are more SMART focused and more about building these adaptive interventions at these longer timescales, but leveraging technology to collect the type of data we might need to do this. And then there's just-in-time adaptive interventions where you're trying to intervene in the real time. And so the types of questions you're interested in smarts are, I want to compare initial intervention options. I want to compare DTT to Jasper at this first round. The second type of question is, I want to compare second stage options. I want to know for non-responders, which option was better? Was it better to just continue with what we had them on initially, or was the augmentation strategy a better thing to do? And finally, I want to compare embedded adaptive interventions. And we'll talk about what I mean by embedded adaptive interventions in a second. So the first comparison is actually what you're going to do is you're going to take all those individuals who received DTT initially and all those individuals who received Jasper initially, and we're going to compare those two in sort of a two-arm trial kind of way, where the idea is you really want to understand, was it better overall across the population to start with DTT, or was it better overall to start with Jasper? And this is the typical primary question for a SMART trial. So when you're designing a SMART and sizing a SMART, the typical idea is you're going to compare these initial options. The second hypothesis that you're going to test is typically asking around, for non-responders, was the augmentation strategy I employed better or worse? And so here you can actually see we're going to pool across D and H and compare D and H to C and G. And the reason is because, again, the question isn't, was DTT Jasper better than DTT? It was augmentation for non-responders a better thing to do than not augmenting? So that's why you're pooling C and G and comparing it to D and H. And then the last question is about these embedded adaptive interventions. So just to point out, within a SMART, in this particular SMART, there are multiple embedded adaptive interventions. So an adaptive intervention, just reminding you, everyone, right? You had initial intervention, and then at 6 weeks, you had responders and non-responders, and you had to decide what to do. And so the sort of reddish colored one up here is one particular adaptive intervention where you start with DTT. For responders, you augment with parent training, and with non-responders, you augment with Jasper. The other embedded adaptive intervention is starting with Jasper, augment it with parent training for responders, and augment with DTT for non-responders. And you can already see now that there's actually, well, in this case, there's 8 different adaptive interventions. 2 to the 4, 2 to the 3, 16 adaptive interventions. Mental math, sorry. But the idea is that for each of those options, so I'll give you another one that could be an adaptive intervention in here. DTT, for responders, you continue with DTT, and for non-responders, you augment with Jasper. That would be a different adaptive intervention. You have now collected data using the SMART on all of these different adaptive interventions, which means you can answer questions about comparing them. So I can compare the one highlighted in red to the one highlighted in blue and ask questions about which one was better on average for participants. Okay. I will mention, and again, just because of time, I won't be able to go into the details, although I'm happy to discuss it. You cannot just directly, you have to be a little bit careful when you do these comparisons, because in certain designs, responders might get treated differently than non-responders. And so there are methods and there are analytic strategies that account for the randomization probabilities themselves. So I won't go into the details about that, but I want to point out that when I say analyze the data, you have to be a little bit careful, and I'm happy to talk more about how to be careful. But at a high level, the goal is pretty clear, which is I want to compare AI1 with AI2. And so in this case, you're going to compare the red to the blue. Often when people ask these type of primary aim hypothesis 3 questions, it's either comparing a intensive strategy from option DTT to intensive strategy under Jasper, or it's sort of comparing the most expensive adaptive intervention to the least expensive adaptive intervention. So it's sort of, there's different types of comparisons you might want to do. And so those will guide this primary aim hypothesis 3. And then there's the follow-up question. So the 1 through 3 are the basic questions you're going to answer. They're your primary questions. They're about initial options, secondary options, and the most important embedded adaptive interventions that you care about. But of course, now you have data from a SMART, you can ask a bunch of secondary questions as well. And the typical secondary questions are about constructing more deeply tailored adaptive interventions. So when I say deeply tailored, what I mean is instead of taking response status and just saying for all responders, we're going to give DTT plus parent training, it may be that a subset of responders, it's better to give parent training and DTT, and for a different subset, it's better to give DTT. And so you're going to tailor even further to particular values and variables you've collected on these individuals. So an example would be for responders with high parent buy-in, it might be better to add parent training. But for responders with low parent buy-in, it might just be better to continue with DTT by itself. And so in this case, what you'll have is you'll have data from a SMART in which you've collected as a potential tailoring variable, the variable parent buy-in. So you will measure on the parents whether that you think they have high or low parent buy-in. You did not use it in the randomization scheme, but in an after-study analysis, you can now ask the question, for those parents with high parent buy-in, did I see it? Was it better for those responders to add the parent training or not? And in this particular case, this is an example of a more deeply tailored AI where we're tailoring on this parent buy-in variable. And so that's the benefit of a SMART trial. You have these AIs in mind, you have these questions in mind about building an AI, and it's allowing you to ask sort of sequences of questions, hypothesis 1 through 3, and then building on top of that more deeply tailored AI. So you can continue to do this. Now, of course, you have a SMART of size 100 patients. There's only so much you're going to be able to do in terms of answering all of these questions with a single data set, but at least it's going to guide you in terms of your next experiments you do. For example, you might learn that the parent buy-in is important, and so your next experiment that you might run is comparing this particular deeply tailored AI to sort of a let's say treatment as a sort of standard of care treatment, and so that might be the next one you run after that. Sort of facilitating Q&A again, the questions I often get is, does all research on AIs require a SMART? So every time people bring up AIs, meaning I want to design an adaptive intervention, they automatically assume I need to run a SMART trial. And that's just not the case. So if you already know what the AI will look like, you already know what your adaptive intervention might look like, it's actually much better to just run a standard 2-arm trial where one arm is usual care or treatment as usual, and the other arm is the AI that you're gonna implement. So often what people will do is they'll run a SMART to build their optimized AI, what the AI they think should work in practice, and then they'll run a secondary trial, which will be an RCT comparing their AI to the usual care. Okay. The other question that I get is, and this is something I think comes up a lot in the design of the experiment, so it might be something that comes up when you're working on your particular projects for this mHTI, is the tailoring variables embedded in a SMART, do they have to be research assessments? Oh, let me see, sorry. My speaker died, so I'm switching to headphone mode. So why you have, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It's why you have to have, the speaker, the headphone, all the different sets for Zoom. So the question that often gets asked is, I have a bunch of research assessments, and you might use those to build your tailoring variables, but it's often the case that the embedded tailoring variables in the SMART are not research assessments, because you're trying to build you're trying to build an AI that isn't about research, it's about actual practice, right? And so if there are research assessments that aren't going to be collected in the real world when you try and deploy this AI, then you can't rely on them to build your tailoring variables for your AI. So typically the tailoring variables are guided by what are actual data that I'm going to be able to get in a clinical or actual real world setting to guide the design of my adaptive intervention. They aren't necessarily research assessments. They often are not research assessments. So in this particular case, right, going back to here, at week 6, it's always going to be the case that these individuals these autistic individuals are going to come back to therapy weekly. And so at week 6, you're going to be able to assess response status, because in practice, you're going to have the data to assess response, right? It's not the case that these were research assessments that you're relying on, so then when you move to the real world, you don't have them anymore. And so often it's the case you want to think about, is this something when I move from my SMART trial to deploying my AI in practice, am I going to be able to do that, or am I going to have to add additional burden on the clinic because they're now going to have to collect research assessments every week? And that's usually not going to fly. Okay, so what I'd like to do here now, and my goal again was to get here about noon, so this is good, is to sort of pause and answer questions you might have about SMART trials, and the difference between SMARTs and AIs in particular. So I'm going to pause and just answer any questions you have. I see Mo Bashir has a hand raised.
Hi, great presentation. Actually, 2 related question I have. One is, when you are like going for more granular question or more like this hypothesis at the more like second stage intervention, how do you calculate the power and think about the population that you are going for? Because with each of your hypotheses, that will depend. And second related question is, when you are comparing at this like granular level between 2 groups, then how do you control for other like confounding variables? Because it will depend on like which bucket they are in at the end, right?
Yeah, so I think let me reiterate your question just to make sure I got it exactly. So your concern is, what if I want to move to the secondary question? How do I power for it? Because now, how do I guarantee? So I say 2 things. First off, when you're going for an NIH grant, just pure grantsmanship point. Okay, so if I were going for a grant involving SMART trials, I would not power for the secondary analysis. I would power for the primary comparison. If you already knew that you were going to say, you already had a pretty specific AI or subset of AIs you were going to focus on, then maybe you'd power for this, but it's often the case that you're going to do it as secondary analysis. If you power for it, it's quite hard. You'd have to make guesses around how much high parent buy-in versus low you're going to have, how many students or how many kids will be responders. You'll have to make some assumptions, and then from there, I think you could do a power calculation, but you have to make some assumptions to move forward there. On the point around, I think your second question was how to worry about confounding. So because you randomized at each stage, the fact that certain parents with high buy-in will be responders. So it might just be the case that parents with high buy-in have a higher response rate for their kids than parents with low buy-in. But because you're randomizing still at this level to parent training versus just DTT, sorry, just DTE is a power company, DTT is the training. DTT, you're going to be okay for that analysis. You're not relying on them choosing between which direction to go in. So it's sort of the sequential randomization saves you from that potential confounding that you were worried about. But I agree, like often what I'll see is people will do like choice-based designs where if they're responders, they get choices, and then certain families might choose one direction or another based on treatment to go down. And in that case, you definitely have to worry about what you're mentioning, and you have to say, I've controlled for confounding and by measuring a bunch of other things. So I'm with you. But that's the benefit of the randomization here.
Thank you.
I see Ravi has a hand raised.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Mobashir. I also had the power question in addition to another question. So the second question I have is, like putting on my HCI hat, like how does SMART play with the human-centered design process? Like, so many times when we are designing sort of early trials, we do some formative studies to just figure out like what are the particular tailoring variables we want to focus on, and being a bit more pragmatic than just relying on existing sort of publication or existing evidence. So how would you sort of design SMART, or how can you sort of pilot test a SMART before actually going all in? So you're reducing the likelihood of your actual tailored variables being more successful.
That's a great question. I'm going to give a hopefully adequate answer. Although again, I'm a statistician, so I'm putting on my HCI hat, which is not even a good. It's quite bad. So we'll try. But this is a good question for Peja, who's coming in about an hour to talk.
Okay.
Because so I would say you should ask Peja as well, because I think Peja will have a much better answer than me. My main takeaway here is because the randomization are at 6 weeks, right? You're not going to really run pilot participants fully through the SMART in a way you might do for an MRT, which I'll mention down the road. Because an MRT, right, you're doing pilot participation. It's typical that you can do a lot of the piloting on people who aren't even in the population, and you can do a lot of so that's the pilot side. On the collection of potential tailoring variables, I'd say two things. One is most people, like Connie running this study, have a long history of working with this population, and so she has a pretty good idea of what tailoring variables that she might want to include, both based on historical literature as well as based on her own practical experience. But even then, right, you would still work with, I think they would do qualitative interviews ahead of time to sort of make sure that this is the direction they might want to go. So more like that the population is engaged in the process of building the potential tailoring variable list. I think that is a typical example now where people are less and less going out and saying, I know exactly what variables I should be collecting in this study population as potential tailoring variables, and more sitting down with those individuals in those populations and saying, okay, these are the ones we think make sense to collect. But if you sit down with the parents, they're going to have strong opinions about what other variables might be important to assessing response status. And I think that's also getting buy-in because again, these are trying to be effective trials, not efficacy trials. I think John also had a hand raised, but I don't see it anymore. John, did you have any?
I had it up. No, that was the last question was primarily the same, but I want to go back to sample size and also grantsmanship with this type of approach. Like you might want to propose something like this for a nice big grant, but at the same time, how do you present pilot data, preliminary data in your grant to try to say that this is needed without fully piloting something like this that's going to be underpowered?
That's a good point. I think there's so I'm going to say two things. One is the D3 lab, which I'm affiliated with at Michigan, has a whole institute focused on grantsmanship around smarts. So I'm going to do the 30-second version of that. But I think it's definitely a hard sell if you don't have preliminary data. But the preliminary data doesn't have to take the form of a SMART. I think it's often the case that what you'll have is observational data suggesting that there are some people who are responding to initial treatment and who are not responding to initial treatment. And you can then motivate that question of what should we be doing for non-responders? We're not doing enough. So often it's the case that you have different levels of treatment that have individually been tested in the study population. So you know that there's a very expensive option and a very cheap option, or there's multiple options that have been tested, but you want to think more carefully about a stepped care approach. That's like a very traditional motivation for a SMART. And so you want to say, is it better to start with the cheaper option than the more expensive, and then augment with the more expensive? That's the typical motivation. And so you have data on sort of each component. You have evidence that DTT works, evidence that Jasper works, evidence that parent training works. But what you don't have evidence for, and you have evidence that people who start with DTT, some are responding and some are not responding, right? So you have motivation for all the key components in the SMART, but you don't have SMART data so far. And so I think that's the prototypical setting you'll be in when you're sort of designing a SMART for the first time. And that's also why the primary hypothesis is just initial intervention. What should we do? Because if you try to size for any of these secondary aims, you're going to be looking at sample sizes that are very, very large, and you're going to be very unlikely to be successful in that grant, or have enough funds even in certain R01s to have money for that kind of sample size. But yeah, that's sort of my main response.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I want to mention just a few things embedded in SMARTs and how a lot of questions people are asking more and more they'll think I have to run an MRT if I involve mobile health technologies, but sometimes what they're really talking about is incorporating an app to monitor someone's behavior, provide encouraging messages, but they're really want to design a smart trial because they're thinking of the change, the meaningful change. Remember, like what your goal is to improve some type of outcome, and so you're thinking about when do I expect meaningful changes to take place in that, and if they're happening at a much more sort of either at the monthly time scale, like I talked about in this example, it might make more sense to incorporate digital technologies, but still have the design be a smart. So an example, that the two places mobile health technologies get involved in smarts is, one is you might randomize where one of your components is just they have access to a mobile app with a bunch of content on it or not. So like you'll see a lot of smarts more and more incorporating mobile health technologies through what kind of intervention as an intervention option in and of itself. And then the other thing is it's becoming more common that response status is assessed through and uses digital technologies to assess response status. So if you have wearable data on an individual, right, you're trying to get people who are, let's just say it's a weight loss program and you have the digital technology is a smart scale that you have at home that they're supposed to monitor their weight daily. There you're incorporating the digital technologies through the definition of response status. And so I just wanted to point that out before we move on, that even though I'm talking at a level so far where there was no mobile health explicitly stated in either example, the technologies are being more and more embedded either as an intervention option or as a way to monitor outside the clinic and extend the clinic so you have data on individuals to build better tailoring variables. Okay. Okay, let's go on. So the only thing I'll apologize for is that my slides, I switched the style because, I'm combining slides from like different spots. So this is my Jedi slides. They are all Star Wars themed because Jedis, etc. So this is a part that I wanted to talk about on connecting AIs to Jedis. And so what we're really talking about here is how the framework for adaptive interventions, the 5 key elements, how they really are the same as when you move to Jedis. It's just there's certain small tweaks that we're going to make. So I want you to think about them as very related, but I'm going to point out the key differences. So we're going to talk about those 5 key elements, and then we're going to talk about Jedis in this this probably only be like a 15-minute quick discussion, I think. So just to remind everyone, I know I say it pretty much, I try and say it every 30 minutes in one of these kind of things, just because it's something that I want to drill home, which is the adaptive intervention is the intervention design. The smart is the experimental design. So when we're talking about AIs, we're talking about designing a treatment, and that design of that treatment is trying to accommodate heterogeneity in response to treatment and build intervention options that adapt to specific and changing needs of the individual. The 5 key elements we talked about were decision points, tailoring variables, decision rules, intervention options, and outcomes. The adaptation process takes in the variables, the rule, and the intervention options to adapt to an individual. Decision points are when we trigger the adaptation process. The monitoring matches to the tailoring variables. You individualize to an individual based on the decision rule, and the intervention options are what are delivered. And guiding all of this are the proximal and distal outcomes, where, just to remind everyone, the distal outcome is that final outcome that we care about. It is the ultimate goal of the intervention you're building. The proximal outcome is the goal of the intervention in that moment. So you're trying to improve a proximal outcome. And by doing that, if you think the proximal outcome is sort of a mediator on a mediation pathway, by improving that proximal outcome, you'll achieve the distal outcome. So in our example, our tailoring variable was response to medication in those ADHD, the kids with ADHD, or no, those adults with ADHD. We monitored every month, and this goes to the question, I believe, I can't remember who asked, but someone asked this question earlier. Why every month? Because response to medication was thought to likely change meaningfully over the month. Oh, I shouldn't say where. So where is at the clinic? No, where is at the, in this particular case was, when I say clinic, it's really part of the school. So it was the school was monitoring these individuals. So that meant that we should build decision points that trigger every month. But the key connection to just-in-time adaptive interventions is we're going to take the same things, but instead of thinking about response to medication, I want you to think about something like craving. So in this case, thinking about an individual who's trying to quit smoking, and we're thinking about craving, a cigarette craving in this particular case. So when do we think craving will change potentially meaningfully? Well, we might expect meaningful changes in craving to occur very rapidly, right? So you have an individual who hasn't smoked for a while, they're trying to be abstinent, and the craving goes from very low to very high quite rapidly. What else do we expect? Well, we expect it to be changing in their natural environment, right? So we expect these changes to happen rapidly in their natural environment. So that means that the monitoring needs to be ecological. It needs to be, we need to monitor these individuals in their natural environment. We can't wait for them to come into the clinic to monitor them, because we're going to expect meaningful changes well in advance of them arriving at the clinic. So this means that this sort of motivates the need for decision points to trigger. In this is a hypothetical example, every minute, every 5 minutes at a very rapid time scale is the key point. It also means that our intervention options need to be timely and ecological. I can't have an intervention option anymore in this particular example that requires the person, multiple times a day to come to the clinic. I have to think about intervention options that can be deployed in real time and in their natural environment. And so this motivates this idea of just-in-time adaptive intervention. So the idea behind just-in-time adaptive interventions, specifically in mobile health, is that we have tailoring variables that we expect to have meaningful changes over shorter time frames. So a few days, hours, minutes, or even seconds. And they'll occur, these changes occur in their natural environment, which means we need to monitor in a rapid and ecological fashion. We can no longer rely on the individual coming to the clinic every month to assess some outcome in order to decide what to do. It also means that we have to have decision points that trigger in a more flexible way in both in terms of time and location, and that our intervention options also need to be timely and ecological. So what I want you to think about when you're connecting AIs to JEDIs is it's all about time and time scale. So the sort of structure of an AI and the structure of a JEDI, when you're talking about them, they'll have the same 5 elements, the same guiding principles in terms of a distal outcome and a proximal outcome. It's just now we're thinking about variables, tailoring variables and outcomes that are going to change more meaningfully on a rapid timescale, which means we can no longer rely on intervention options being deployed in the clinic or monitoring at the clinic level. We really do need to start deploying mobile health technologies. So this slide comes from Billy. I like it a lot, so I use it, and I just want to give her credit. So Billy Nahumshani, who I think you watched maybe a recording of hers so far, but have not met her. She is a behavioral scientist at Michigan. And the way she talks about that is, let's ignore mobile health technology for a second. What do you really want? Well, what you would really want in these kind of JEDI settings is a therapist in your pocket. Maybe you wouldn't want them exactly in your pocket, but you'd want someone in your pocket who is going to monitor craving continuously and decide whether and how to intervene based on the level of craving and deliver the intervention as soon as craving occurs in your natural environment. So in this context, you would have a behavioral scientist or therapist sitting in your pocket, popping out, monitoring craving, and monitoring you to decide what's the best intervention option we can deploy in that moment. But of course, we can't do that. And so that's where the mobile health technologies come in. They come in 2 different ways. And I like to point them out because we often conflate the 2, and I just want to keep them separate. One of them is to monitor your status and context. So we might use mobile health technologies to monitor how the individual is doing. So using either active data collection like ecological momentary assessments, or wearable passive data such as skin response, physical activity, so accelerometer or GPS. So we have different ways of monitoring the individual using wearable technologies, but we also have, so just a point, go back 2 slides. Digital technologies allow you to monitor, but they also give you ways to deliver intervention options, right? And so the second way we use mobile health technologies is to deliver the intervention as soon as it's needed in the natural environment of the person. So mobile health technologies fulfills 2 roles in the context of JEDIs: the monitoring and the intervention delivery, okay? And so often it's the case that we think of them simultaneously, but I want to keep them separate, because there's going to be questions when you're building technologies for just-in-time adaptive interventions around how do we do the monitoring, and there'll be questions you're going to ask about what interventions are you going to deliver, and I like to keep them separate in my head in terms of building the mobile health platforms. So what is a JEDI? So a JEDI is an adaptive intervention. It still is. It includes adaptation, but the goal is to provide what's called just-in-time support. Provide the right type of support at the right time while minimizing disruptions. And the idea here is timing is event-based. It's unexpected, meaning you can think about craving. Craving will vary rapidly in your natural environment, and you don't know when craving will go up or down and move around. And so when you can't expect a moment to be a high craving moment. So those events are unexpected. That's different than, I'll just give you a simple example of where you don't really need just-in-time support, but you might need support, would be, I know that someone has to take a pill every day at 4 p.m., right? In that context, that is an expected time. I don't need to monitor you continuously to make sure that you're going to have this event that has to happen by 4 p.m. At 4 p.m., I can just check in and say, hey, did you take your pill? And so what a JEDI is really focused on are situations where an event may happen, but it's unexpected, and we want to provide the right type of support in that right moment and minimize disruptions to your natural environment. And so these can occur over short time frames. Typical examples are minutes or hours, but you can also include maybe every day or so as a shorter time frame. And of course, why JEDIs and health behavior interventions? You need to address health-related events that can change rapidly, unexpectedly over short time frames, and in the natural environment of the person, while minimizing disruptions to daily life and routine. So I want to end this section before, because I like saving about, I'll save some time for questions, and the MRT is really, it's going to be the bulk of the last part of today. Talking about an example of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. So there's no randomization here. This is just a deterministic algorithm. It's by Dave Gustafson at Wisconsin. The system is called HS. It's a smartphone application to support recovery from alcoholism. So HS is one study that used this system. Another one was a recovery support services study run by, I forgot that, I'll remember the name in a second. So this is a common design for this particular population. It has both static content, so it has relaxation, audio guided relaxation videos, interactive features. The one I'm going to talk about in terms of a JEDI is a particular GPS triggered system. So at the outset, an individual who enters the study or enters this particular app is asked to put in high risk locations for that person. So I enter the study. I go into the map. I believe one of the study I'm most familiar with that uses this was in Chicago. So you go into the map of Chicago and you click different locations that you know are high risk locations for you. So places that you used to do drugs, places like a bar that you used to frequent, something of that nature, where you know these are triggers for you in terms of potential risk of drugs, or in this case, alcohol. And so what the system does is every single minute, using the phone, the GPS on the phone, if the distance was less than 10 feet from the high risk location, the system just sent you a message asking you if you wanted to be there, asking you if you needed support. Otherwise, it didn't send a message. So we still have all those elements we talked about. We have tailoring variables. Here it's GPS-based tailoring variables. But again, remember, this is rapid and ecological, meaning I'm monitoring these tailoring variables using passive data on the scale of every single minute. We have decision points every minute. We have intervention options that can be deployed in a rapid and ecological fashion. These text messages do not take much time to send from the system. And my decision rule is still this part in red. It's sort of an if then else kind of framing, which is easy to follow and can be easily coded in terms of a mobile health intervention. The distal outcome is alcohol abstinence. That's the overall goal of this intervention package of HS. But the proximal outcome, the immediate goal of such a JEDI is to reduce risky drinking days. So by reducing risky drinking days, you're trying to improve the chances of achieving alcohol abstinence. Again, this allows you to be flexible in terms of when decision points occur. I just want to point out, before I didn't have my last slide was supposed to say Q&A, but I guess it got deleted. I want to point out two quick things on this because it sounds all nice and perfect. The first thing is, and this is I like to point these out. So one issue that can come up with mobile health technologies is their reliability. So in this case, I said, if distance is less than 10 feet from a high-risk location, do this. And I do want to be clear, at least when this technology was built, so if you see the picture of the phone that I have here, you can guess that's a pretty old phone, which is probably from like the early to mid 2000s. And so back then, GPS was not as reliable in terms of being within those 10 feet was hard to achieve. And so often you would have missed time points because the person would be within those windows, but actually you couldn't measure it. So that's the first thing I want to point out. So this if else rule is quite nice, but can be fallible in the context of mobile health technologies. The other thing I want to point out, and it's something that they moved away from, is it was often the case that individuals would get close to locations, but actually be at low risk. And so there is some movement away from using just GPS by itself to monitor as the only tailoring variable. And so there is sort of a movement towards using a little bit of additional data beyond GPS and not just relying on GPS in such a setting. But the key point for building a JEDI, and the thing I want you to take away, is the JEDI is an AI, but you need to think more carefully about rapid and ecological deployment, rapid and ecological monitoring, and rapid and ecological intervention options. So you have to think about a more flexible sequence. And it's because of the fact that the tailoring variables may experience large and meaningful changes on a shorter time frame. Okay, so I'll stop there to answer questions about JEDIs before I move on to MRTs, but hopefully this at least clarified the difference between JEDIs and AIs for you. Questions? No questions. I'm okay. That makes me happy, I guess. So okay.
Sorry.
Yes,
this is CJ again. So
Yeah,
I'm trying to wrap my head around. I enjoy this. I mean, your lectures because it sounds so makes sense as a clinician or the design. Yes. So in the JEDI or AI, I mean, is more like a one, maybe for JEDI is one group design. I mean, what is your main hypothesis? Is it people assigned to JEDI compared with the regular no JEDI or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think both you and John in the earlier one was like preemptively guessing my link to the next part, right? So like in a good way. So here, this is a world in which you know ahead of time exactly what you want to do in a given context. So I know when I'm building this JEDI I know that if an individual is near a high-risk location, this is exactly what I'm going to do. But you have questions about that. So so I think John's question in the last one was like, can I include additional behavioral intervention options, even if I've already given it to them, which sort of motivated the like, that's a question you could answer using a smart. Here, right, you might ask, well, was it really helpful to send a message when they're near a high-risk location? Should I be tailoring on additional variables? Was the message itself, like, was this a helpful message? Or what kind of messages should I send, right? Those are the questions you're going to ask. and they're going to motivate this micro-randomized trial design, which is you're going to have questions about building a Jedi, and you're going to use the MRT to answer those questions. Okay, so I think in this context here, right, the only part, you might have questions about different parts of HS, right? But for now, the only one I'm focused on is this Jedi. And the question is, when I'm building this Jedi, A, is it effective at all? Meaning, should it be included in a future intervention package, right? Should this Jedi be a thing that I keep building? The second question is, does the effectiveness vary with certain moderators of interest? Meaning, does it vary over time? Does it vary based on week versus weekend? Those types of questions. And then the last one is there a lot of differences between individuals? So I actually really need to personalize the messaging or personalize the delivery times to different people. So is there a lot of heterogeneity that I need to account for? And so all of those are kind of questions you're going to motivate the MRT. But what I want you to get away from, what I want you to take away from this slide and from this discussion is the Jedi as a design really motivates the use of mobile health technology, both for monitoring and intervention delivery.
Well, thank you. I feel more things to think.
Yes, both in a good and a bad way. So we're gonna rotate to my last set of slides, which I think gets to this question. And yeah, new set of slides, new set of pictures, but that's fine, and it's themes. So I think the CJ's question, your question is really the heart of these micro-randomized trials. So I think the way I want to motivate this is you have a Jedi in mind. So you know you have some behavior that you're focused on. You want to improve some proximal outcome. You have some distal outcome in mind. So like, again, what's guiding any AI or Jedi is a proximal and distal outcome that you're focused on. So alcohol abstinence, risky drinking days, right? Those are your distal and proximal outcomes. And you're trying to build a just-in-time adaptive intervention. And so there's many questions you're going to have when you're building it. And I want to focus on ones you have to answer before you even start running a study, and ones that you can answer after the study's run and sort of secondary analysis. Okay. So what you might do is you might build an initial Jedi that involves delivery of these messages at what you think of as potentially risky times. But you do have some trade-offs to think about a priori, and we'll talk about them in the context of a study in a second, but I wanted to mention them ahead of time, which is you need to ensure low treatment burden and high engagement while maximizing therapeutic effects. So in the context of HS, you might find that if you made that location too wide, so instead of 10 feet, you made it, let's say, within a block, the system might be delivering messages way too frequently, right? So if I live somewhere and it just so happens I always have to walk somewhere near this high-risk location, and I make those GPS grids way too large, I might end up sending you way too many treatments. So those treatments might have some therapeutic value, but be highly burdensome and therefore lower engagement. So a priori, what we often need to do when we're thinking about a Jedi is think about, for this particular population, in this particular setting, what is sort of an average number of treatments per day that we think that the population could tolerate? And that'll guide the initial Jedi. And then we'll talk about, and so what the MRT is trying to do is it's trying to answer the question is, with this initial Jedi, should we include it in a future intervention package? That's the primary question we're trying to answer. And then the secondary questions are, is the intervention effectiveness under the Jedi change with time? And then how can we improve upon this initial Jedi? So I think to make this all concrete, I'm going to talk about a particular example. So this is actually Pedja and Susan. Pedja's study, Pedja was PI. Susan and I were involved as statisticians in the study. It's called Heart Steps. Heart Steps is a 6-week physical activity clinical trial for improving the physical activity sedentary adults. These sedentary adults were given a Fitbit tracker and a mobile phone application on the phone to help improve physical activity. And the goal from building a Jedi perspective was, I want to build a just-in-time adaptive intervention that uses incoming data to improve physical activity and through this improve long-term health outcomes. So the distal outcome was sort of health outcomes more generally. The proximal outcome was physical activity. And our JEDI was going to take into account in data coming in real time to decide whether or not we send an intervention to try and get the person to be physically active. And what those interventions looked like were these messages on the right. So these, this is a HeartSteps message. It would pop up on your phone. It was, I'll just read it out loud. What warm, healthy treat could you make today? Maybe tea or soup. You could do squats or jumping jacks while the water heats up. So these were, I hate to say cutesy, but they were like, you know, fun messages you could receive to try and get someone to be physically active. In this particular case, this is what we called an anti-sedentary message. It wasn't trying to get you to go for a long walk. It was just trying to get you to sort of move around a little bit. Other messages you might have received would be things like, go for a walk until you see a squirrel, I think was one message I remember. And the goal of these types of messages was to try and get you to be physically active, and by doing so, improve your long-term health. So I'm going to show you a diagram now of what HeartSteps looked like. And so HeartSteps was an MRT, a micro-randomized trial. What micro-randomization refers to is, just like a JEDI had to be more frequent in terms of monitoring and intervention options, a micro-randomized trial is now a sequentially randomized trial where instead of the SMART, where you're randomizing once a month to sort of at a lower frequency, you're now randomizing many, many times a day because you're trying to match the time scale at which you expect meaningful changes to take place. So I'm going to walk you through this diagram just in the context of HeartSteps. So in HeartSteps, remember the distal goal was to improve physical activity in the 42 days. The proximal outcome, the proximal goal was to improve your physical activity. The way it worked was you actually had, and I'm going to focus primarily on this first pathway. We had observations coming in on the individual. Those observations were things like location, weather, motion, as well as some EMA responses that we got throughout the day. The first question we asked was, and it's sort of thinking about it in a just-in-time setting, was the individuals were given their 12-hour day. They were allowed to select 5 times a day at which we could potentially send them a message. So these 5 times a day were chosen to reflect periods of the day where we thought there might be a lot of variability in step count. But even if we expected variability in step count, we wanted to make sure that this JEDI was adaptive to the individual. What do I mean by that in this context? Well, if an individual is driving a car, it's probably not a good idea to send a text message to that individual. So from an ethical standpoint, we might not want to send you we shouldn't send you messages when you're driving. And so we are adapting to that sort of incoming information. We also know if an individual is already walking, they're already doing the thing we want them to do. We're not going to send a message on top of it saying, hey, can you keep going for a walk? So if they're already doing the behavior that we wanted, we decided that was also a situation in which we weren't going to send a message. And so these are taking into account, again, rapidly incoming information through wearable devices and through the phone to monitor the individual to decide not to provide an intervention. So that gives me my first driving no, walking no. And then if they're not driving or walking, we randomize them. So this R here is for randomization for an average 3 times a day to receive a tailored prompt to become physically active. So I want you to talk through this 2 different pieces. So first is when we randomize in a micro-randomized trial, unlike the SMART, where the SMART for the most part, it's usually 50-50 equal probability randomization. Here you can already see that we're averaging 3 times a day of sending something and 2 times a day of not sending something. So the question I often get asked is why 3? The reason was, again, going back to, I think, another question that I got earlier about how do you know ahead of time how to design these things? Pilot data and qualitative interviews with the population suggested on average 3 messages a day would be tolerated by this population. So this was a priori, we decided on average 3 messages a day was something that the population could tolerate, but we had no other information about how to adapt. And so we did what we call an exploration policy, which is we just, on average, 3/5 probability we sent you a message, and with probability 2/5 we didn't send you a message. But when we decided to send you a message, we tailored it to your current context. So we didn't send you a message that was generic. We sent you a message that depended on things like weather and location. So a really simple example would be, if it's currently raining outside, we're not going to send you a message that asks you to go for a long walk in the park, right? So we're going to take into account your current weather to know what kind of messages are appropriate for that context, as well as location and time of day. If you're at home, we might send messages about cooking, like the message I showed you before. If you're at work, we're not going to send you a message about going for a long walk because we know you're at work, and so you're probably not going to be able to go on a long walk. And weekend versus weekday was another thing that was taken into account. So these messages, even though they were randomized with equal probability, they're tailored messages. And I want to distinguish between these two different features. These tailored messages are trying to improve your physical activity. And so we use the Fitbit to monitor physical activity in the next 30 minutes. And so what you really want to think about this as a sequence of observations. We observe things about the individual. Treatments, we decide to intervene or not intervene on an individual, and outcomes. And we sort of sequence through this multiple times a day. And so this process runs 5 times a day for 42 days, leading to over, I think it's 210 time points at which we could potentially send you a message. Instead of moving forward, I feel like all the other slides I kind of kept going until the end for Q&A. I just want to make sure that this design, this mRT design makes sense to everybody, and any questions that you might have about either this particular design or how it works more generally. All right, I'll ask myself a question. That way I can. So the normal question I get asked is, okay, you said average 3 times a day, but what if at the end of the study you realize that was a bad thing to do, right? And another point I want to make is, why just do this? Why didn't you try and learn a better policy on an individual, right? So people who are more familiar with reinforcement learning or familiar with personalized medicine kind of approaches might think that this is really simple and way too simple, and we should do something more. So the 2 things I wanted to say to that are, 1, stick around for Susan's talk in 2 hours from now, or an hour, I guess, an hour and 20 minutes from now, where she'll talk about methods and ways in which we can improve upon this simple scheme. So Susan's talk will really focus on the personalization aspect. And the thing I wanted to mention, though, is why we start with this. Well, we start with it because we really don't have a lot of data a priori to know, beyond dose constraints, what are times at which messages are most effective. And so often we're in a situation where initially in an MRT, we'll just try and achieve a dose constraint that we think sort of minimizes burden while maximizing therapeutic effect. And then after that, we'll explore all possible contexts with equal probability. So that's sort of the idea behind these initial MRTs. But again, after you run an initial MRT, you're going to come back and learn a lot from that data to improve upon your trial design and improve upon the policy. And that's what Susan will be talking about in about an hour and 15 minutes. What I wanted to talk about for my last, I'm going to leave 10 minutes at the end to sort of open-ended discussion. What I wanted to mention to everyone is sort of, how do you analyze data coming from this type of trial? So this is a much more, and smarts are already quite complicated, but you can kind of imagine here that the data coming from this MRT is even more complicated than the SMART trial. And so I want to motivate and explain to you the kind of analysis we do in an MRT. And then I'll end by just talking about the common pitfalls in MRTs, having run a few of them to date, and what the headaches are, just because I know most of you might want to do an MRT for your project. And I just want to point out a few headaches that you might have to consider. So this is my slide for those who aren't familiar with experimental design. Why are we micro-randomizing? It's to assess causal effects. But what I want to talk about, let me skip ahead just for time. What I want to talk about is the types of effects that we are really interested in assessing. And for MRTs, what we're really interested in are these effects of these types of messages, or these types of JEDI, these sort of local interventions on proximal outcomes. So we're sending you a message to try and get you to be physically active. And what the primary question we typically ask is, was that message we sent, which we call AT, effective in improving your proximal outcome, your step count in this particular case? So our primary analysis is just sort of this is sort of goes back to the scientific question, should we include this intervention at all in a future intervention package? If we see that beta naught was 0, meaning sending a message versus not sending a message, this is a binary indicator, sending a message versus not sending a message has no impact on my outcome at all, then there's no point, just to go back to heart steps, that whole intervention I built I think it took 1.5 years to build out that system. So if it's the case that we don't really see an impact of these messages at all, then it probably isn't worthwhile maintaining that system moving forward, and we should just remove these types of activity messages. So the primary analysis takes this form, and you can think of it conceptually as we're going to model the outcome Y as a function of treatment and maybe some variables that we think are related to the outcome. So things like past step count is going to be predictive of the outcome of interest, and so we might include those as well. So for those of you who've seen like regression analysis, roughly speaking, you can think of this as a regression analysis. That's our primary analysis, where we're trying to understand the marginal or average impact of treatment over time. But of course, the impact of treatment over time is going to potentially vary. And so our secondary analysis might be things like this. So it might vary with time and study. It might vary with your current level of engagement. And so our secondary analyses are going to take the form of assessing the treatment effect, but assessing how it varies by different, what we call moderators. So one analysis we might do is we might look at, we might measure engagement, which is how many times did the individual enter the Heart Steps app over the last week? And so ST is sort of a measure of engagement. And we might want to ask, well, was the treatment more effective for individuals who are highly engaged in Heart Steps compared to those individuals who have low levels of engagement? So while the first primary analysis was about whether or not to include this intervention component moving forward, these secondary questions are more about what tailoring variables should I consider in a future just-in-time adaptive intervention? So should I tailor to current level of engagement? Should I tailor to week versus weekend? Should I tailor to current levels of physical activity prior to the time point? These are all the secondary analysis questions we're going to ask, and we're going to get data to suggest which ones we should include when building our JEDI moving forward. Okay. And this is just a mathematical way of saying it. I'm going to skip that just to not scare anyone off from these types of methods. What I want to point out, there we go. What I want to point out is how we do it. It's really simple. And again, so I didn't show any math for the SMART. I'm going to show it for the MRT. The way we do it is we really just analyze the data, and it looks a lot like a regression analysis. So for those of you who've seen regression analysis, it's very familiar. The main thing is we're just trying to assess the causal effects. And so this piece here is going to give us the causal effect of treatment given a moderator of interest. And that's the effects we're going to look at. We need to wait because, again, the weights are going to deal with the randomization probabilities. But what I want to emphasize to you is there's all the software now exists to do these analyses. And conceptually, what you're doing is you're building regression models where your regression model is just trying to understand the effect of this intervention conditional on some moderator of interest, with the ultimate goal of building a set of moderators that will now be your tailoring variables for your next MRT. So in a very simple example, let's just say current engagement mattered. What I would do, or what Susan would do, I guess, in her talk, is now this R would randomize, but it would randomize where engagement would impact the probability of treatment. And so that would be the next study. I'll use those tailoring variables we learned and use those learned tailoring variables to change this little piece to depend on engagement, to depend on time of day, not just have the tailoring done on the prompt itself. Let me just check time. Okay, I wanted to walk you through an analysis instead of going through the math. I want to walk you through an analysis. I'm going to walk you through an analysis of the intern health study just to give you a different study in which is a little bit simpler. So the intern health study was a micro-randomized trial in a study of medical residency programs across the US, in which you had interns who were just starting their residency, and we know that those individuals are at high risk of sort of weaker mental health, higher rates of depression. And so the study, the PI, Srijan Sen, had a question which was, can we use digital technologies to monitor mood, activity, and sleep, and then use those outcomes to improve mood, activity, and sleep over the course of their first year in residency? The way it was done is every single week, I'm just walking you through this diagram, every single week they were randomized with 3/4 probability of receiving some type of notification and 1/4 probability of not receiving a notification. This was done because we thought that having sort of once a month, having a week off was a good idea. They're in sort of high pressure situations. We don't really want it to be that they're always receiving notifications. So 1/4 probability of no notification was thought to be effective. If they received one of these types of weeks, they were randomized every day to receiving a potential message versus not receiving a message. And the goal was to have, so if you were receiving activity notification week, it looked like heart steps. You were receiving, hey, you should be physically active today. Hey, the tips were things like, here's a way to be physically active with a highly demanding job. Alternative life insights were things like, we saw that you had low step count yesterday. Here's, keep at it. You can improve your physical activity. So these messages were tailored to the individual's data, or they were providing generic tips. And we were collecting mood, step, and sleep data over time, with the proximal outcome being sort of an aggregate average daily mood, step, and sleep count each week. So we had 26 weeks. Every single week, every individual in the study was randomized to either receive a notification week or not. And if you were in a notification week, you had probability half of receiving a notification each day. Here's the analysis that I do, sort of the first analysis for that primary that we talked about. This is done for mood. So I just want to show you for mood. The causal effect of sending you a message was seen to be positive if we account for prior mood. So if we account for prior mood, we see an effect of sending you a message. That effect is relatively small, but it is significant. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. For step count. So on weeks that we had step count, we sent you step count notifications. We saw that sending you a message around your physical activity got you to be more physically active. So that's what this blue bar is saying. This lighter bar is saying that on weeks which you receive the mood notification, your mood did not improve on the following week. So we sort of primary aim analysis shows that we should probably move forward with our step count analysis and understanding how to improve the step count intervention component, but the mood notifications were actually not as effective. And so potentially we might want to remove them in future studies. Here's what the analysis looks like over time. It's a lot, so I'm going to focus on the right-hand side. What I want to show you is these curves are kinds of curves you'd see in an MRT analysis. So at a high level, what you're looking at is the effect of the intervention on every week of the study. So I've never been in a residency, but my sister is a resident right now. So I've asked her, and early on, she was excited and was trying to improve her health. Like if she got these types of notifications, she said, yeah, it might make sense that if I received a physical activity notification in the early weeks of being in residency, I might have worked on them. But by week 20, what you're seeing is that effect dissipates. And so often in MRTs, what you'll end up seeing is early on in the study, you'll see the effectiveness is strong or at least somewhat significant and will dissipate over time. And what we're seeing here is by week 20, the effectiveness of sending even a step notification was 0, meaning that, yes, we had an effective JEDI in the sense that the MRT is sending messages at the right time. However, that effect dissipates and usually dissipates by week 20. In most MRTs to date, this type of dissipation is very common, meaning you have highly motivated population who want to receive these types of notifications, and then the effect dissipates usually by 2-month to 3-month windows. Okay, I have a few minutes before I want to stop. What I want to mention is, and I'm going to make one last point instead of going to the next set of slides. Here you can see that for mood, on the other hand, there is no significant effect either early on or late on in the study. Now, this analysis was done according to this particular design. meaning this picture is the picture I was given, and this is the picture we had hoped to implement in the real study. I want to end with one final point because I think it's something that I have underestimated, and I think we should think about moving forward. And I want you to be thoughtful about it when if you're designing an MRT as part of your project. And that is two things. One is this design, when I hand it to the programming team, does not mean it is exactly what the programming team implements. So I have an experiment that I'd like to run, either the heart steps diagram I showed you before, or I show you this diagram for intern health. What ends up happening from a practical standpoint is I then hand this diagram to a programming team or an app development team that has to develop an app to do these things. I have noticed in about, I'll be 2/5 of the studies I've been involved with to 3/5. So somewhere between 40% to 50% of studies I've been involved with, the randomization scheme does not match the design that you intended, which is not great, A. And what that means is you'd have to think more carefully about pilot testing than any. Pilot testing is like the thing that I think will save most of the studies that I've worked on to date, and there's not enough pilot testing going on. And the second thing is all of the analysis that we've done to date pretends like we know the randomization probability. And so we've designed methods to handle this. And I just want to, instead of showing you the method, I just want to show you the results, which is, it turned out that after we accounted for, so in this particular study, it turned out if you were randomized to treatment, you were automatically, or sorry, if you were randomized to no treatment, you automatically received treatment the next week. So whoever built the app built it in this way. That's not what we intended. And so what we ended up seeing is if we analyze it with that in mind, the effective step count actually does go away slightly, meaning you don't see as strong of an effect if we account for the actually implemented randomization probabilities. And then the second thing is we have missing data because these mood scores are mood surveys filled out on a daily basis. And if you've ever tried to do mood scores over the course of 2 to 3 months or longer than 6 months of time, you're going to know that late on, the amount of missing data increases drastically. And so we have methods to handle missing data. And so once we account for both the randomization probability issue and the missing data, it turned out that not that the mood, it wasn't that it was ineffective, it actually lowered mood overall compared to, so if you sent a mood intervention, you had a negative effect of mood early on, which is the direction we wanted to see, meaning the direction we didn't want to see. We actually were harming mood by sending mood interventions. I don't know how to interpret it because I've just started to think about it a little bit more. My guess is sending mood interventions early on to someone in residency might actually just make it more obvious that they're in residency and have less control over their situation, something of that nature. And so this actually doesn't suggest a null effect, but suggests as a deleterious or iatrogenic effect. And so it actually suggests even stronger, we should get rid of the mood interventions than before. So with that, I wanted to save, 7 minutes. My goal for this last part was to cover the difference between, to cover MRTs. In particular, MRTs are a slightly different problem than the SMART. So for SMARTs, your goal, as I talked about before, was to really analyze and understand these embedded adaptive interventions. With MRTs, what you're really trying to do is just optimize a JEDI sequentially over time. The way we do it is we run an initial MRT to collect some data, to understand the dose levels, to understand things like what moderators are important, and then build upon that to build a new MRT in which we build more personalized treatments moving forward, which is what Susan will talk about. And I want you to think of MRTs as more optimization focused. You're trying to build a better JEDI over the course of multiple trials. And the key point is that this is all motivated from scientific questions you have. So when you're moving forward in your projects, I don't want you to start with what is the experimental design I'm most interested in. I want you to start with what is the scientific questions I have, and then think about what experimental designs are most appropriate. In many settings, the MRT is appropriate, but it may be the case that your scientific questions motivate a more simple SMART or a more simple RCT design, and that's okay. I think the MRT is a very useful tool for building and optimizing JEDIs. But if you already know the JEDI that you want to have in mind, then this MRT protocol isn't really as necessary. And with that, I'll end and I'll sort of open up to open-ended questions. I know we have 5 minutes left before Pedja comes, so I'll answer any questions you have as to the best of my ability, and I want to thank you all for your time.
I put a question in the chat.
Mhm.
I was just curious, when doing the just-in-time adaptive interventions, is it common practice to also measure more of as of a secondary analysis, but the motivation to change? Because they're getting these messages, and like you said, the proximal outcome may be, in your example, more steps taken, right, for higher movement, but they could be more motivated to take the steps. And so, because, change is a process. And I was just wondering, is it common to also get, and I'm just kind of thinking about my own study design, is it also common to get their motivation when you're doing this type of intervention?
Yeah, so I have one follow-up question for you just to make sure. So I could say two things. So one is there's baseline motivation, which we can definitely collect. So for example, a baseline survey is often done, and I think what we've noticed is things like your motivation to become physically active and sort of, in this case, in other situations, but if you're in a hypertensive population, right, you might ask questions about your motivation for behavior change, and those are predictive of treatment effects that we see in the population. So there's baseline motivation, and then there's ongoing either motivation or engagement, I guess I'd call it, right? And in both situations, you can monitor engagement either passively, or you can also try and get active collected data on sort of motivation at a weekly level or daily, depending on the time scale you're interested in. What that would change is two different things, and I just want to be clear. One thing it could change is how often you provide treatment. So it might be for lower motivated people, you don't want to bother them as much, and so you might adapt the randomization probabilities accordingly. So that's the first thing. So that's this one here. I'm trying to circle it. There we go. This one here. The other thing, and Billy's done I think has a couple papers on this, so I'm happy to share it if you email me. She's focused on a lot of times when we think about engagement, yes, you could change the policy, the JEDI that you're implementing to depend on levels of engagement, but we also can build JEDIs that directly target increasing engagement themselves. So instead of trying to do a one size fits all where you're trying to balance things inside of this one particular intervention about physical activity, you might also have in the background another JEDI that you're learning on through an MRT that is directly targeting engagement and motivation. And by doing so, you kind of break it into two different problems.
Gotcha. Thank you.